Hey, this is Matt from the Woodworking Nook. Today we're going to be building a small workbench out of 2x3s. This workbench is based off of how my workbench is built, but instead of using 2x4s, I'm going to be using 2x3s because those will be plenty strong. I'm a big fan of building workbenches out of 2x4 or 2x3 material. Mainly because it's cheap and it's super sturdy. The main obvious downside is that it's not super straight. So as long as you get used to using shims for drawers or the top, you should be good. So right now I'm just screwing these together. I had 2-inch screws left over and I wanted these to be a little bit deeper, so that's why I'm countersinking them a little bit so that they sink into the wood a little bit more. And then marking out the holes for the legs so that I could get a total of 4 screws, 2 on each side for the legs. I always use screws with my workbenches and don't necessarily glue them together, mainly because I often like to change things around, and screws allow you to do that. So right now the workbench is upside down, and that's the bottom piece for the bottom shelf that we're going to add. Again, just adding those screws in. The 2x material is plenty strong for a workbench. I did notice that in the center there it was kind of a wide gap, so I decided to add a stretcher across so that there would be a little bit more support in the middle there. And this is just leftover laminated 3/4 inch plywood that I had laying around, so I just wanted to use this up. So I cut it down into 2x3 material that I could just screw in. I add these little stretchers on top to make sure it sat flush with the other 2x3 material. And of course I need to pre-drill this because I don't want to split the plywood edges on that. For the worktop, I wanted to use this leftover MDF, similar to what my worktop is. Problem was I was about 2 inches off on one side for the top of this workbench. So I decided to glue these two pieces together using biscuits. Not a practice that I normally do, but it's just a workbench, so it'll be fine. So just cutting this down to size and then cutting those biscuits on the side. That way everything sits flush. You could do this same process with just glue, but the biscuit joiner will allow it to sit flush with one another. You could also use pocket holes if you don't want to use glue. Again, it is a workbench, so it's not that big of a deal. And I'm gluing this oversized, that way I can cut it down after it's all been glued up. And once that was dry, I took it out of the clamps and cleaned it up a little bit and then cut it down to size. This track saw hinge that I have here has been really handy for the previous projects that I've been doing. I should be having a video reviewing this 3D printed track saw hinge coming up soon, so make sure you're subscribed to see that come out. Once that was done, I worked on the bottom pieces. And the bottom pieces I decided not to connect together. Again, because it's a workbench, it doesn't matter that much. My issue was, though, these legs, I needed to cut a square on each corner so that they would fit around the legs underneath. So I used a jigsaw to time to move on to the one drawer that will sit underneath the worktop. This is going to be a very large drawer. I believe these drawer slides are 26 inches long. So right now I'm measuring the width of the drawer. You want to make sure that number is exact and use the drawer slides and the material as reference for getting that number. Because again, with the workbench not being super straight, a lot of the times that number can be off from what you had originally planned. And I'm making this drawer out of 1/2 inch material. I use a very basic process for building these drawers. They will be glued and nailed together. So what I do is I have this large bottom piece that's also 1/2 inch, and I glue each piece and nail it in to have a super solid drawer. It's not the prettiest drawer, but it does work well. And keep in mind that you can only use side mount drawer slides when making this kind of drawer. The bottom mount will not work as there's not that gap underneath. This is a process of how all my shop drawers are made, so I decided to use that same process. And then rounding over the edges on the drawer. And even when you try to measure exact, sometimes it just doesn't work out. Here it's a little bit tight, so what I needed to do was use my router to cut a little groove for the drawer slides to fit in, just taking off 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch to make sure it fits properly. And then making sure it pulls out correctly. Once that was done, it was time to actually install them. Doing one drawer slide is pretty simple, as you can just measure down. When installing drawer slides, make sure the workpiece is on its side. It's just the easiest way to do this. That way you're not holding the drawer slide while trying to install it as well. Once that was done, I needed to create a face frame for the drawer. I had some leftover 3/4 inch Baltic birch ply that I wanted to use. I also didn't want to use a drawer handle on this drawer, as it will be used in a garage with little space. So I used this 4-inch hole saw to cut out a little groove for your hand to pull the drawer open. So I used the hole saw to cut the hole, and then used the track saw to cut it to size. That way there was just a small groove in the middle of the drawer. To install the drawer face, there are definitely better ways to do this, but I just decided to try and brute force it and just hold it together. And this worked out well. I had screws ready to go in the back that screwed it in. After that was done, it was time to make sure the top was all sanded down and apply some finish to the top. I applied this Danish oil. I actually don't recommend using this. It added kind of like a soft feel to it. I think because it needed more coats, not totally sure. On my workbench, I used a hard wax oil, so I'd recommend doing something like that. Then I applied some pocket screws to hold down the worktop and the bottom shelf. That way we could remove it if we needed to. And once that was done, it's time to add some finishing touches to the front of the workbench. Since this is based off of my larger workbench, I had decided to give this workbench a name of the quarter nook. My workbench is about 8 feet long, and this is about 2 feet. This is a great basic workbench that you can build in any size. This one turned out great. Happy birthday, Dad.